Sepah Navy, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. From now on, all navigating through the Strait of Hormuz is forbidden.
Every single day, nearly 20 million barrels of oil pass through a narrow stretch of water barely 21 miles wide. That passage is the Strait of Hormuz. It sits between Iran and Oman, connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Tankers carrying crude oil, liquefied natural gas, and refined fuel move through it constantly. More than 150 ships cross the strait every day, each one carrying cargo worth hundreds of millions of dollars. For decades, analysts have said one thing about this waterway. If it ever closes, the world economy feels it instantly. On March 2nd, 2026, that warning suddenly became reality. Iran announced that the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Within minutes, global markets reacted. Oil prices jumped sharply. Shipping companies began rerouting vessels. Tankers slowed down or stopped entirely. But in the Persian Gulf, something else was already happening. The U.S. Navy had been preparing for this exact scenario for months. And when the order came to respond, the plan moved into action almost immediately. The real question was never whether the strait would reopen. The real question was how much damage would be done before it did. Why the Strait of Hormuz matters. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz measures just 21 nautical miles across. That may sound wide, but for modern shipping, it is extremely tight. International navigation rules divide the strait into two shipping lanes, each only about 2 miles wide, with a buffer zone separating them. Every tanker entering or leaving the Persian Gulf must pass through these narrow corridors. The numbers are staggering. Roughly 18 million barrels of crude oil and 2 million barrels of refined petroleum products move through the strait every single day. That represents close to 1/5 of the world's oil supply. Most of that energy flows toward Asia. China receives the largest share. India, Japan, and South Korea depend heavily on these shipments as well. Europe also relies on fuel that travels through these waters before reaching ports across the continent. Liquefied natural gas shipments add another critical layer. Qatar alone sends massive volumes of LNG through the strait, fueling power plants and factories across Asia. In total, about 1/3 of global LNG trade passes through this narrow maritime corridor. There is no easy alternative. Pipelines cannot replace these volumes quickly. Other sea routes are thousands of miles longer and far more expensive. If the Strait of Hormuz shuts down, even temporarily, global supply chains immediately begin to strain. Insurance markets react, energy prices spike, and governments around the world start searching for emergency solutions. That is why the strait has always been considered one of the most important strategic choke points on Earth. And it is also why the threat of closing it has long been one of Iran's most powerful geopolitical tools. Tehran makes its decision. In Tehran, the debate over closing the strait had been building for weeks. Inside Iran's Supreme National Security Council, officials argued fiercely about the consequences. Some ministers warned that shutting the strait could trigger economic disaster, not just for global markets, but for Iran itself. After all, Iran also relies on the same waters to export its own oil. But hardliners believed the move would demonstrate strength and force the international community to back down from mounting pressure. On the afternoon of March 2nd, the Council finally voted. The result was decisive. 9 members supported the closure. 2 voted against it. Within hours, The order moved down through Iran's military chain of command. Senior figures inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, known as the IRGC, began preparing enforcement measures across the Persian Gulf. The message was broadcast early the next morning through official military channels. The statement was simple and direct. The Strait of Hormuz was now closed. Any ship attempting to pass through it would face the full force of Iranian naval power. For shipping companies and oil traders watching the news unfold, the implications were immediate. But out in the waters of the Gulf, another force was already in position. 2 U.S. carrier strike groups had been operating in the region for weeks, and they were about to play a central role in what happened next. The blockade begins. The announcement spread across global shipping networks within minutes. Port authorities in Dubai, Singapore, Rotterdam, and Shanghai began receiving urgent alerts. Tanker captains already approaching the Strait of Hormuz suddenly found themselves in an impossible situation. Proceed forward and risk attack, or stop and wait in open water. Many chose to stop. Satellite tracking services quickly showed the impact. Normally, more than 150 commercial vessels pass through the strait every day. But within hours of Iran's announcement, traffic dropped sharply. Large oil tankers began anchoring outside the Gulf. Others slowed down and drifted, waiting for instructions from their shipping companies. At the same time, Iranian naval units moved into position. Fast attack boats from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy spread across the narrow waters. These small but heavily armed craft were designed for speed and surprise. Many carried anti-ship missiles, rockets, and heavy machine guns. Along the Iranian coastline, radar systems activated. Missile batteries were brought online. Drone operators began launching surveillance aircraft to monitor the shipping lanes. The message Iran wanted to send was clear. The closure was not just political, it would be militarily enforced. Within 24 hours, satellite imagery showed the dramatic result. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had fallen by nearly 70%. The world's busiest oil corridor had become eerily quiet. But the silence would not last long. The first ships are hit. Late on the evening of March 2nd, 2 tankers attempted to move through the strait despite the warnings. The first was the MT Alkara, a large crude carrier transporting oil toward Asian markets. The second vessel, the ST Horizon, followed several miles behind. Both ships were operating under commercial orders issued before Iran's announcement. Their captains believed the threat might only be political theater. They were wrong. Shortly after entering the narrow shipping lanes, radar systems along the Iranian coast detected their movement. Within minutes, IRGC units began tracking the vessels. Drones circled above the ships. Fast attack boats moved into range. Then the strike came. Missiles launched from the Iranian coastline streaked toward the tankers. Moments later, explosions ripped through the side of the MT Alkara, tearing open part of its hull below the waterline. Thousands of tons of crude oil began leaking into the sea. Crew members rushed to contain the flooding while issuing emergency distress calls. But the attack wasn't finished. Minutes later, the ST Horizon was hit. A missile slammed into the vessel's midsection, igniting a massive fire that quickly spread across the deck. Flames climbed high into the night sky as crew members scrambled to abandon ship. Rescue vessels eventually pulled survivors from the water. But not everyone made it. 3 sailors were killed. Several others were seriously injured. The message was now unmistakable. Iran was prepared to use force to enforce its closure. No tanker, no cargo ship, and no commercial vessel would be allowed to pass safely. Markets panic. The attacks sent shockwaves through global energy markets. Oil traders in London and New York reacted immediately. Brent crude prices surged dramatically, climbing more than 30% in a single day. Within hours, prices pushed past $110 per barrel. For major energy importers, the sudden spike created massive pressure. China, the largest buyer of Gulf oil, faced billions of dollars in additional costs almost overnight. Refineries across Asia began scrambling for alternative supplies. India, Japan, and South Korea all faced the same problem. There simply weren't enough replacement shipments available. Insurance markets reacted just as quickly. War risk premiums for ships traveling through the Gulf skyrocketed. Coverage that normally cost a few $1,000s suddenly jumped to tens of thousands per voyage. Some insurers stopped covering Hormuz transits entirely. Without insurance, most shipping companies refused to send vessels anywhere near the strait. By the following day, major oil companies and shipping giants had suspended all traffic through the region. The Strait of Hormuz had effectively become a dead zone. But while global markets were reacting with panic, something very different was happening inside the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. In Bahrain, American commanders were watching the situation unfold in real time, and the forces already stationed in the Gulf were far from small. Two of the most powerful warships on Earth were sitting just beyond the horizon. Aircraft carriers USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R. Ford. Each one carried an entire floating air force, and both had already begun preparing for the next phase of the crisis. The U.S. Navy moves into position. Long before Iran announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the United States had already built a powerful military presence in the region. At the center of that presence was the U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain. Its mission was simple but critical: protect maritime traffic in the Persian Gulf and ensure that international shipping lanes remained open. When Iran declared the strait closed, that mission suddenly became far more urgent. Two American carrier strike groups were already operating inside the Gulf. The first centered around the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln. The second was built around the Navy's newest and most advanced carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford. Each carrier carried more than 70 aircraft, including F/A-18 Super Hornets, electronic warfare jets, surveillance planes, and helicopters. Together, they represented one of the most powerful naval formations on the planet. But the carriers were only part of the force. Surrounding them were multiple guided missile destroyers, including ships like USS John Paul Jones and USS The Sullivans. These vessels were equipped with the Aegis combat system and powerful radar arrays capable of tracking hundreds of targets at once. Their mission was to protect the carriers and defend the fleet from incoming threats. Beneath the surface of the Gulf, American submarines were also on patrol. One of them was believed to be the Virginia-class submarine USS Missouri, operating quietly in deeper waters while monitoring Iranian naval movements. By the time the first tanker was struck, American commanders were already receiving constant intelligence feeds from satellites, drones, and surveillance aircraft. They knew exactly what was happening, and they had already begun preparing a response. The orders from Washington. In Washington, the situation was escalating rapidly. The attacks on commercial shipping and the closure of a critical international waterway were seen as a direct challenge to global trade and maritime law. Senior officials held emergency briefings throughout the day. Soon after, the Pentagon made its position clear. During a press conference, the U.S. Secretary of Defense delivered a direct message. The United States would not allow any nation to close an international shipping route through force. Protecting freedom of navigation had long been a core principle of American naval strategy. Allowing the Strait of Hormuz to remain blocked would set a dangerous precedent for the entire world. Orders were issued to commanders in the region. American forces were authorized to defend commercial vessels and respond to any hostile action threatening navigation. At the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, operational plans were already being finalized. Rear Admiral R.C. Gordon, one of the senior commanders overseeing operations in the Gulf, summarized the situation clearly. American forces would monitor the strait continuously. Any Iranian unit threatening shipping would be intercepted. If necessary, those threats would be neutralized. The objective was straightforward: reopen the Strait of Hormuz and restore safe passage for commercial vessels. But everyone involved understood that achieving that goal could mean direct combat. Radar screens light up. Late on the afternoon of March 3rd, radar operators aboard American destroyers began noticing unusual activity. The powerful Spy-6 radar systems mounted on the fleet's Aegis destroyers were constantly scanning the surrounding waters and airspace. Suddenly, new contacts began appearing across the screens. Fast-moving objects were approaching from the direction of the Iranian coastline. At first, there were a few. Then, there were dozens. The radar picture quickly became crowded with signals. Several fast attack boats were racing across the water. At the same time, low-flying drones appeared on radar, approaching the fleet from multiple directions. Moments later, the most dangerous signals appeared. Missile launches. Iranian anti-ship missiles had been fired toward the American formation. Inside the combat information centers of the destroyers, alarms sounded. Within seconds, the Aegis combat system automatically began analyzing the incoming threats. The system quickly separated friendly aircraft, neutral vessels, and confirmed hostile targets. Missile defense crews moved into action. Launch hatches opened along the decks of the destroyers. Seconds later, SM-6 interceptor missiles blasted into the sky. Their job was simple: destroy the incoming threats before they reached the fleet. White trails streaked across the sky as the interceptors raced toward their targets. One by one, Iranian missiles began disappearing from radar screens as they were destroyed high above the water. But the battle was far from over. Because while the destroyers were defending the fleet, another order was already moving through the command network, and this order would shift the operation from defense to attack: the first intercepts. Inside the combat information centers of the American destroyers, everything moved fast, but remained controlled. Radar operators watched as the incoming missiles continued to approach. The Spy-6 radar systems tracked every object in the sky, constantly updating speed, altitude, and direction. The Aegis combat system processed the information automatically. Within seconds, it identified several confirmed threats. 7 anti-ship missiles were racing toward the fleet. Multiple drones were flying low over the water, and several fast Iranian boats were moving quickly toward the outer defensive perimeter. The response began instantly. From the deck of the destroyer USS John Paul Jones, Vertical launch cells opened one after another. SM-6 interceptor missiles shot into the sky, their engines leaving bright trails across the horizon. Guided by radar, the interceptors raced toward the incoming threats. One missile disappeared from the radar screen, then another. Within seconds, several of the Iranian missiles were destroyed high above the water before they could get anywhere near the fleet. But a few threats continued through the defensive layers. That was when the ship's close-in weapon systems activated. Mounted on the decks of American destroyers were rapid-fire cannons designed to act as the last line of defense. The systems automatically locked onto incoming targets. The guns opened fire. Streams of tracer rounds filled the sky as the cannons shredded the remaining missiles and drones. Within moments, the airspace around the fleet was clear. None of the incoming weapons had reached their targets. But on the surface of the water, the situation was still unfolding. Several IRGC fast attack boats had managed to slip closer toward the American ships. They were small, fast, and heavily armed, and they were now within striking distance. Helicopters enter the fight. From the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, a pair of MH-60R Seahawk helicopters lifted into the air. These helicopters were specifically designed for maritime combat. They carried advanced radar systems, machine guns, and precision weapons capable of destroying small surface targets. Within minutes, the helicopters were flying low over the Gulf. Their sensors quickly picked up the Iranian boats racing across the water. The pilots did not wait. Machine guns opened fire first, sending bursts of rounds toward the approaching craft. One of the Iranian boats slowed as damage spread across its hull. Then a precision missile launched from one of the helicopters. Seconds later, an explosion tore through another fast attack boat, sending debris across the water. The remaining vessels quickly turned away, racing back toward the Iranian coastline. The immediate threat to the fleet had been neutralized. But American commanders understood something important. If the Iranian missile launchers and radar systems remained active along the coast, more attacks could follow. The fleet could defend itself for hours or even days. But reopening the Strait of Hormuz required something more decisive. It required eliminating the systems enforcing the blockade, and that meant striking targets on land and at sea. The order to strike. At 1620 local time, a new order moved through the fleet's command network. The defensive phase of the operation was ending. The next phase would focus on removing the threat entirely. Missile cruisers, destroyers, and submarines across the region began preparing their launch systems. Coordinates for Iranian radar stations, missile batteries, and naval command centers had already been identified. Now those targets were about to be engaged. Moments later, the first missiles launched. From hidden launch cells aboard American warships, cruise missiles shot into the sky before leveling out over the water. Flying low to avoid radar detection, they raced toward the Iranian coastline. More missiles followed. Then more. In total, dozens of precision weapons streaked toward pre-selected targets along the coast. Their objectives were clear: destroy missile launchers, disable radar systems, and eliminate the Iranian naval units enforcing the closure of the strait. Among the most important targets was the Iranian frigate Jamaran, one of the most prominent warships in Iran's navy. The vessel had already fired missiles earlier during the confrontation. Now it was about to become a target itself. Within minutes, American surveillance drones began transmitting live images back to the fleet. On the horizon near Bandar Abbas, explosions began lighting up the coastline. The strikes had begun, and the balance of power in the Strait of Hormuz was about to change dramatically. The fall of Iran's flagship. As American cruise missiles approached the Iranian coastline, surveillance drones and satellites monitored every movement in the region. One of the most important targets was the Iranian warship Jamaran. The Jamaran was not just another patrol vessel. It was one of the largest surface combat ships in Iran's navy and served as a major command platform for naval operations in the Persian Gulf. At the time of the strikes, the ship was operating near the port city of Bandar Abbas, close to the northern entrance of the Strait of Hormuz. Moments earlier, it had participated in the missile launches targeting the American fleet. Now, it was about to face a response. Low over the water, several American cruise missiles closed in on their target. Their guidance systems adjusted constantly as they approached the ship. Then, the first impact came. A massive explosion tore through the side of the Jamaran's hull. Seconds later, a second missile struck near the ship's command structure. Flames and smoke quickly rose above the water. The ship attempted to maneuver, but the damage was already severe. Two more missiles followed. One struck near the rear of the vessel, destroying part of its propulsion system. Another hit close to the weapons deck, triggering secondary explosions inside the ship. Within minutes, the Jamaran was heavily damaged and losing power. Surveillance drones captured the moment as the vessel began to list sharply to one side. Then, slowly, it started to sink. No distress signal was detected. The ship's tracking system had already been turned off earlier during the confrontation, meaning its final moments were visible only through military surveillance feeds. The destruction of the Jamaran carried more than just tactical significance. It removed one of the key command ships coordinating Iran's naval operations in the region. Without it, many of the smaller Iranian vessels were suddenly operating without centralized leadership. Across the northern Gulf, Iranian boats began retreating toward coastal bases. The blockade that had begun only a day earlier was already starting to weaken. Clearing the mines. While missile strikes targeted Iranian launch sites and naval assets, another critical operation was beginning inside the Strait of Hormuz. Iran had long relied on naval mines as a major part of its strategy to block the waterway. These mines could be anchored to the sea floor or left drifting in the shipping lanes. Even a small number of them could make commercial shipping extremely dangerous. To reopen the strait safely, those mines had to be removed. Specialized U.S. mine countermeasure ships moved into position near the entrance of the strait. Among them were vessels such as USS Osprey and USS Richmond, designed specifically to locate and neutralize underwater explosives. These ships were supported by underwater drones and remotely operated vehicles capable of scanning the seabed. The process began carefully. Autonomous underwater vehicles moved slowly across the shipping lanes, using sonar systems to identify suspicious objects. Whenever a mine was detected, a small remotely operated vehicle would approach it. Explosive charges were then placed nearby. From a safe distance, operators triggered controlled detonations, destroying the mines without risking nearby ships. The operation continued for hours, then for days. Slowly, the dangerous obstacles scattered across the strait began to disappear. Within the first 48 hours, naval teams had cleared large sections of the main shipping lanes. By the third day, the majority of known minefields had been neutralized. safe corridors through the Strait of Hormuz were beginning to reopen. Traffic begins to return. Once the mines were cleared and Iranian naval activity decreased, the next step was restoring commercial shipping. American destroyers and patrol aircraft began escorting vessels through the strait to ensure safe passage. One by one, the first tankers cautiously began moving again. At first, the traffic was slow. Shipping companies were still concerned about security, and insurance costs remained extremely high. But as each convoy passed safely through the strait, confidence gradually began to return. Satellite tracking services soon showed ships moving through the corridor again. The Strait of Hormuz, which had been nearly empty just days earlier, was slowly coming back to life. The blockade that had shocked the world only a short time before was now collapsing. But the economic impact of those few days would take much longer to recover from, and the confrontation had already changed the strategic balance in the Persian Gulf. The strait reopens. By the fourth day after the closure, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz had changed dramatically. American naval forces had cleared large sections of the shipping lanes. Iranian missile batteries along the coast had been heavily damaged. Several naval units that had attempted to enforce the blockade had either been destroyed or forced to retreat. Now, the final step was restoring normal traffic. Early that morning, the U.S. Fifth Fleet announced that secure navigation corridors had been established through the strait. Warships from the United States and several allied nations moved into escort positions along the route. Surveillance aircraft patrolled the skies above the Persian Gulf, watching for any signs of renewed attacks. One by one, commercial vessels began moving again. The first tanker convoy entered the strait slowly, escorted by American destroyers on either side. Radar systems constantly scanned the surrounding waters, while helicopters circled overhead. Nothing happened. The ships passed safely through the narrow corridor and entered the open waters of the Gulf of Oman. Soon after, another convoy followed. Then another. Within 24 hours, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz began to resemble normal conditions again. The waterway that had been nearly silent just days earlier was once again filled with tankers, cargo ships, and LNG carriers moving toward markets around the world. The physical reopening of the strait had not been negotiated. It had been enforced. The economic shock. But even though shipping had resumed, the economic impact of the closure was already being felt across the globe. During the crisis, oil prices had surged past $110 per barrel. Energy markets had reacted instantly to the sudden disruption of nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply. For countries heavily dependent on Gulf energy exports, the spike created enormous pressure. China, the largest importer of Middle Eastern oil, saw billions of dollars added to its energy costs almost overnight. India, Japan, and South Korea faced similar challenges as refineries scrambled to secure alternative supplies. Insurance markets also remained cautious. Even after the strait reopened, war risk premiums for ships entering the Gulf remained several times higher than normal. Many shipping companies demanded naval escorts before sending vessels through the region. Global markets slowly stabilized over the following weeks. Oil prices gradually fell as shipments resumed and supply chains adjusted. But the brief closure had demonstrated just how fragile the world's energy system could be. A single narrow waterway had temporarily shaken the entire global economy. The strategic consequences. For Iran, The decision to close the Strait of Hormuz had been intended to show strength, but the results were far more complicated. While the blockade initially disrupted global markets, it also damaged Iran's own economic interests. The country relies on the same shipping lanes to export its oil and maintain trade with major partners. When the strait closed, Iranian tankers were also unable to move freely. In addition, the confrontation had resulted in significant military losses. Naval vessels had been destroyed, coastal missile systems had been targeted, and key parts of Iran's maritime infrastructure had been damaged. The blockade had lasted only a few days, but rebuilding the lost capabilities could take far longer. For the United States and its allies, the crisis reinforced a long-standing strategic message. Maintaining open sea lanes remains one of the most important missions of modern naval power, and the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical waterways on the planet. A lesson in maritime power. The events of those few days offered a clear lesson about the balance of power at sea. Closing a shipping lane is relatively easy. Reopening it requires coordination, technology, and overwhelming force. Iran had demonstrated how quickly disruption could occur, but the response from the United States and its allies showed how quickly that disruption could also be reversed. Within less than a week, the world's most important oil corridor had been cleared, secured, and reopened. The ships returned, the markets stabilized, and the Strait of Hormuz once again became what it had been for decades: a narrow passage carrying the energy that powers much of the modern world. But the crisis also served as a reminder. As long as global trade depends on a few critical choke points, the stability of the world economy will always depend on who controls the sea.